Welcome to Symptomatic Redness. Today it's Derick speaking with John Michael Colón of the DSA. He's also a freelance writer, writing for such publications as the LARB books. And what else have you written for, John?
So I've written for In These Times, and then the Los Angeles Review books, and some other places that are just like too small to mention. And then I've also done I have successfully pitched but not finished my project for Current Affairs, so that'll be coming out soonish.
All right, and you are involved with the Democratic Socialists of America, which is kind of how we got into our conversations, and particularly its Libertarian Socialist Caucus. A friend of mine described you as a social democrat, but at least an interesting one with a brain. I won't tell you who said that, but it's a mutual friend. So
that's, it's not a bad way. I also have a sense of who it was, but it's not a bad way of describing me in a weird way, but it's odd. So like my moral core, I would say, is sort of social democratic. Like ever since I was 14, that was kind of like my minimal politics that came out of like reading Orwell and like reading about the history of the New Deal and the WPA and all this other kind of stuff. I self-identify now as being more radical than that. It's actually weird. I had the reverse trajectory that most people have. I was really kind of like this kind of cynical, kind of Tony Judt post-war moderate. Like, well, capitalism is horrible and it sucks, but it's the but any attempt to really overthrow it will lead to something worse. So you need to have like a disciplined mixed system economy where the rich are tax the hell out of them, and you create like this nice little welfare state with social advancement and minimal decency, right? And then kind of what happened is that after the crash, and especially after the utter betrayal by the social democratic parties of what I had taken to be their like minimally decent ideals, and their further and deepening rather than dismantling of what I later came to call neoliberalism, that term started getting a lot of traction. Like I kind of like revised that and then kind of did like this reverse metamorphosis where instead of being like this young radical kind of person when I was younger and then becoming like a cynical old person, instead what ended up happening was that I kind of like metamorphosized into something much more radical, and I kind of went through like an ultra left phase in like 2013 or so. Like I was very much like, if we can just get like 100,000 people without a permit at the National Mall, we can bring down the government Tahrir style, and actually this would not be a bad thing to do. But then I think it's kind of moderated since then. And I'm not quite a social democrat, I would say, but I think that a social democratic mode of politics that goes beyond like mid-century type social democracy, but uses the same kind of like contesting elections and winning, and blah, 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 is half of a politics that can lead to like a minimally decent outcome. And I think that the other half of it is actually has nothing to do with electoral politics at all, but is building up independent like civil society institutions run by and for working class and ordinary people, that actually have a say over the allocation of resources and labor time and stuff like that. And that is my anarchist influence. So I mean, it's weird because you could call me a reformist anarchist or like a heterodox anarchist Marxist or something like that, because that's kind of the cluster of ideas that I work with. And some people see that as incoherent gobbledygook. I see that as a kind of necessary synthesis between the two biggest strands of the socialist movement.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, and you say that to a person who's known for being a diehard hardliner on most.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yes. Well, look, I can turn things into an incoherent mush, and then you can split them like perfect little hairs, and then that way we can eventually arrive at some kind of sense of what's going on.
We can stash those hairs into something useful. I mean, it's funny because this conversation came out of me complaining about people complaining about me being too Hardline about definitions and complaining about the DSA, and people were saying like Varn can attack the DSA, it's too popular, and I'm like, then that's like drawing a line in the sand. You must want me to attack it. I was feeling conciliatory, but but then you said like, yeah, we should come and talk about it though, because there are things even from your perspective to talk about why the DSA might be worth considering, and yet dealing honestly and coherently with a ton of problems that emerge out of its very popularity in some ways. So,
oh, absolutely. And I think that like it's people, with apologies to my comrades in DSA, is that look, DSA is at bottom, and we're going to, I'm sure, talk about the actual ideological composition and the history and so on of the whole order. At bottom, DSA is a bunch of scared, cultureless, 16, inwardly mobile, upper middle class kids, whose future has been taken away from them, and who are turning away from the powers that be and the established order and the dominant narratives, partly for reasons that they're aware of and partly not, in the hopes that if you throw enough stuff to the wall, something will stick, in terms of like another better world. But
so
at the same time,
demographic to the alt-right, actually, in a weird way.
I actually think that that's exactly right. I think that's quite right, and I think that that's actually getting to the core of something that we should talk about more. But what I wanted to say is, all of that is true, but that is not mutually exclusive from the idea that they're also our only hope. And I think that that's actually something that is really key to my view of the DSA and why I'm a part of the DSA. And there's more to it than that. But like those two things are not mutually exclusive. And I think that that's something that I really want to convey, especially to the more skeptical listeners, is a great deal of what you think about DSA, although not all of it, may well be true, but that's not mutually exclusive from the fact that like the trajectory that DSA has put us on is the only one that can lead to something like a minimally decent outcome for the horrible mess that our world is becoming.
Right. I think it's interesting because when we talk about, a lot of people talk to me about the last mass party in the United States, and they mention the Black Panthers. And I will point out right now that as skeptical as I can be of the DSA, and as much as I still think you could drown it in a bathtub when you compare it to the size of the U.S. population, it's 4 times larger than the Panthers, even when you include the White Panthers, ever were in the height of the 60s. And if you look at the entire New Communist movement and all its various schisms, it's about the same size. So
yeah,
that's
and I think that the I believe that without counting SDS, which was bigger at 100,000 at its peak, without counting SDS, because SDS was apparently not explicitly socialist, the statistic that's been going around in DSA media has been that we are the biggest socialist organization in the United States since the Communist Party in the 30s, which, again, if you skip SDS, that's actually, I'm pretty sure, true. And it's true especially in New York, where we're the first socialist organization that's been able, in New York, since the Communist Party in the 30s, to have branches based on boroughs and ultimately, in some cases, even like neighborhoods. Because like we're big enough that we've got like several thousand people that we can now have like a North Brooklyn, Middle Brooklyn, South Brooklyn, Lower Manhattan, Upper Manhattan, and Bronx. And those are all groups that all have like their monthly meetings and their between the monthly meetings, their own working groups and blah, 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 blah. And they've all got like several hundred people who regularly go to them. So that's a big deal. And so there is a sense of scale. And again, SDS was bigger, and I want to talk about SDS.
Yeah, SDS was a lot bigger, actually, but yeah, go ahead.
because I think that that's like the main people do a lot of comparing the DSA to the Communist Party, which I think is really misguided for a lot of reasons. I think that people compare DSA to the Socialist
Party.
Well, right. I think that people compare DSA to the Socialist Party, the old Socialist Party of Debs, circa like 1900, which is a better comparison, but is way too complimentary to DSA in as much as like it's very aspirational, I think. But the real comparison that I think is the most fruitful one historically, as far as U.S. politics is concerned, is the Students for Democratic Society from the 60s.
Which you and I actually agree on. I think there was a Facebook post where I said that, and I was making fun of the DSA. So to put it out there. But where I was like, the closest analog is still way larger, and that's the SDS, and it was used opportunistically by everybody. And that opportunism led to its undoing very quickly. And I don't mean that the SDS was opportunistic. It wasn't. It was idealistic. It was just that everybody was putting their cadres in to try to get them into leadership to pivot it into their version of an explicit socialist movement. And I'm not saying that's happening in the DSA now, except that there are tons of groups, even groups that are technically formally barred from entering because of their explicit democratic centralism, that are doing that right now. So you want to go into that? I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, by the way, either. Well, go ahead.
Well, it's very complicated. Briefly before getting into answering that, that's circa 68, and I think it's very important as a cautionary tale for DSA, which is why I brought DS up. But there's also the SDS of like 1963, where there's a way in which SDS was an attempt to create a socialism that was homegrown and dependent on all the old theories. And this attempt failed because of what you just described, because that happened. But there was a language that was slowly being groped towards, which we now kind of, like a lot of people roll their eyes at, like participatory democracy and this, that, and the other. But, students and the youth as like, as the revolutionary subject, like blah, 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 blah. The do your own thing, the personal, political, all this stuff. But there is an important way, I think, in which those two parts of SDS are both things that we can compare to DSA, because the first one, the way in which it was this kind of large organ, which because of its size, a lot of little tiny like sectarian cadres tried to turn it to their own advantage so they could turn it into its own like centralist org, and then that ended up leading to the whole thing falling apart. That is the nightmare scenario for DSA. But the promise of DSA is very similar, I would argue the same, as the promise that SDS always had, which is that it's a space which, for a variety of institutional and cultural and material reasons, it has created something that has not existed on the American left in a very long time, which is a space in which it might be possible to articulate new kinds of ideas rather than just kind of endlessly regurgitating old doctrines and dogmas in the manner of revivalist religion. And I think that is actually both of those things, that risk and that opportunity, are key lessons to take away if you're part of DSA and care about it as I do. And even if you're not part of it and you're just interested in its potential trajectory, I think that's the key lesson to take away. But that's a whole story that I think will become more clear when we talk about like the factions, the groups.
Well, let's get to that in a second. But I have to admit that my critique of the DSA right now is that I don't think it's, even though there's tons, everybody from communization theorists, like who would have thought they'd been interested in joining the DSA, to neo-Kautskyeites, to I'm sure Maoists are all over the place, are wanting to enter, and at the same point, the DSA doesn't have a program. It kind of has a platform, but its platform, from an outsider perspective, seems like a weird mix of socialist and leftist shibboleths. And also tailing the Democrats on certain key things. And what I hear from you is what you see in the organization that is interesting is that while its size is predicated on it doing that, it's also its size enables it to actually do something completely different, which is articulate a newer version of socialism.
That's right. And I think that that's a hard sell for a lot of people looking in from the outside, such as yourself, because a lot of this is something that becomes clear if you're involved in DSA spaces, especially in person, because a lot of it hasn't been written down yet, and it's only in its kind of earliest stages of development. But one of the things that I want to convince people of, as I'm talking about my experience in DSA and my read of the culture and stuff like that, is that the germ of that sort of thing really does exist in DSA, like the germ of new kinds of ideas, new syntheses, new theory, new analyses of material conditions that aren't just like, attempting to pretend that we can cosplay, or LARP the Bolshevik Revolution or something like that. Like, but or I don't know, or like the social democratic, the successful social democratic like reform campaigns of the 1890s or something, like, but that are actually like new ways of looking at the world based on the way that the world has changed. The germ of those things does exist in the DSA, I think. Whether or not they will actually be turned into actionable platforms and sort of illuminating theories is an open question, and that's a historically contingent question. We'll see. But the germ of it absolutely exists, I think, and I can explain why if you want, but that's
I do want you to, but I want you to... I'm going to do the infamous Marxist. Let's talk about this dialectically for a second. So let's talk about this dialectically for a second. And I don't mean that in the magic sense of like, ooh, dialectics means I never have to say I'm sorry. I mean it in the sense of like, I think there are two trends in the Democratic Socialists of America because of their history that make it particularly interesting for someone like me, but also particularly historically fraught. So what makes it interesting is the same reason I still maintain interest in like the IWW. Although my own experiences with the IWW, including trying to join, have...
That sounds like a fun story.
Yeah, I tried to join. Basically, I was arguing with someone with the IWW, and they're like, well, you don't know anything about labor organization. I was like, yes, I did, and this is what happened. And then they're like, well, you're lying about being in Egypt. And I'm like, okay, no, I'm not. And I don't want to get too much into that. But so I tried to join the IWW in Utah because there's not many socialist organizations in Salt Lake. But there's a split from the SPUSA that pretty much exists only here. And then there is the IWW. Well, I joined the IWW National on their page by paying all their initial application fees and their first month's union dues. And then no one ever got back to me about how to contact a local. Like, at all. So I immediately was like, okay... where's the meeting? And then someone told me who I needed to contact, and my response was, if they're that disorganized that they can't even like respond to someone writing into their website and joining on their website, then that doesn't bode well. Which maybe they're not, but maybe it depends on the state. Who knows? I mean, like, the thing is, a lot of these organizations are still fairly opaque.
Right. I think that's a very good point. So what did you mentioned a dialectical tension that you identify in DSA. What is that?
Well, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Michael Harrington and the DSA's relationship to the Schechtmanites.
That is an excellent... the easiest way to talk about that is just to go through the history. And it's kind of a long story, and I might get some details wrong because I have some books on my reading list to read that would make all the details kind of precise. So apologies if I make any errors, but I can go into that a little bit if you want. Or why don't you actually, because you might actually have more details than me at this stage.
I don't know that I do or I don't. What I was taught, and remember now, when I say what I was taught, I was involved with a very organization that I am on speaking terms with, but am no longer part of, that had a very sectarian view of Trotskyism, and basically sees everybody's telling everybody else. And I was taught that Schechtman had split with the Trotskyist parties and had entered the SPA, and then was encouraging his cadres to try to change the nature of the Democratic Party by also trying to change the nature of the Republican Party in doing so, because the Democrats were a much more and in the 60s, it makes more sense. I mean, they still had segregationists in the party. They were
the classical 60s realignment strategy.
Yeah, it was a realignment strategy, and it was a mixture of kind of like classical Trotskyist entryism with like a sincere interest in like bourgeois norms. But it was also born out of the Cold War, with a very anti-Soviet Cold War line involved, and how do I even talk about this exactly? But I mean, while it is a myth that Schechtman caused the neoconservatives to exist. I mean, Schechtman had nothing to do with Leo Strauss, for example. It is true that several of his members in the party he was in before he joined the SPA were the youth version of his Workers' Party had become neoconservatives by the end of the 70s. In the context of all this, there's an argument between Schechtman as the SPA was dissolving and Michael Harrington, and I actually don't know the exact details of this argument, that caused the DSA to be formed as a way to kind of influence both within and without the Democratic Party to move into a more socialist direction. Do you feel like that is a fair breakdown of the history in a very loose term? I mean, there's a lot of steps in that I am not covering, but
yeah, I think that probably that's a rough outline of it. I would contest the idea that Harringtonism is Schechtmanism, partly because I think they were different. Schechtman mostly worked through the unions, as I understand it,
right?
Through the big unions, and Harrington was more the one who had the analysis of the Democrats and of the political parties in the United States and so on. And I also think that if I recall, the SPA split wasn't so much Harrington versus Schechtman as it was Harrington versus the people who eventually founded the SPUSA, as I recall.
McNally, more.
Yeah. I mean, it's all of this is kind of double in the details stuff, and you should probably have somebody who actually knows about this or wrote a book about it on. But my version of the history starts a little later. So, as I understand it, the breakup of SDS was in some ways more instructive to Harrington than the breakup of the SP. So Harrington was always kind of a go-between between the generations, as I understand it. Even though he was with in the SDS, he was part of the League of Industrial Democracy, which used to be the parent organization of SDS before they quit because SDS got rid of the anti-communist provision that said that nobody who was a communist could join SDS, and the LID people freaked out and left. Harrington was always kind of a middleman between the two generations, the SDSers and the LIDers, because the LIDers were all these kind of like Irving Howe, like 30s anti-Stalinist left types who would all kind of like, I think had very principled politics in the 30s and 40s, but then like over the course of like, the post-war period kind of became reactionary because of an over-exaggeration of their anti-communism. And then the SDSers who were like looking for new ideas, the beautiful young generation revolting against conformity and blah, 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 blah. So Harrington was kind of in between, as I understand it. And a lot of the readings of him as reactionary come from the point of view of the youth, which of course he was in certain respects. I mean, the biggest betrayal, of course, was the Vietnam War, which he basically refused to take a stance against and was very flaky on, and in private very against the idea of the anti-war movement. But then he kind of like opportunistically shifted. And McNair wrote a good thing about this, I think, in the, what's it called, the CPGB newspaper?
The Weekly Worker, which, was the most original title for a communist newspaper ever. But,
Right. But the thing is that 60s Harrington also had a sympathy for the kinds of things that SDS, before the Maoists showed up and fucked everything up, was doing in terms of articulating a new kind of like socialism as participatory democracy type angle that was more radical than classical social democracy. And I think that there was a weird thing in Harrington, and I have to read more about him because I confess I don't actually have all the details down, but my sense is that Harrington was kind of you can't understand his attitude towards the Democrats, which again I don't actually fully share, but without understanding this kind of like weird in-between position that he had between the so-called radicals and the so-called anti-communist reactionary social democrats. Because what he ends up doing when he creates the DSA in its initial phase is trying to create a group that pragmatically well, it does two things. It pragmatically pressures the Democrats, and this is the famous thing, because you have these two parties that, because of the way that the system is set up, because of the way that we count the votes, because of the way that voter rolls are set up, basically the idea of two big parties, that are like these big two parties, is going to just be like, in the DNA of U.S. politics for, at least barring like a radical overthrow of the Constitution or something. Right. Therefore, like the basic strategy is, well, let's take the one that's kind of like a half-assed social democratic party, and this is especially the case before neoliberalism, and turn it into a proper social democratic party or socialist party. And I think that's definitely part of the strategy. But the other part of it that I think is undersold, and the reason why it's important to talk about it, is because I think that this actually ended up being Harrington's big legacy, especially since realignment didn't work. Realignment was a failure. Neoliberalism happened. The Democrats, rather than going further into a direction of being social democratic after they lost one election, the leadership was like, well, this attempt to be progressive on social issues and be more social democratic didn't work. I guess we're never going to win an election again this way. Now we have to just like be Reagan light. And that obviously manifested itself most with the Clintons, who took over in like the 90s with the Democratic Leadership Committee and blah, 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 blah. But that definitely failed. Absolutely. The interesting thing, though, is that there was another element to Harringtonism, like quote unquote, which was never called this, but my sense of and I'm getting this, by the way, I should say, partly from like a very surface reading of some of Harrington's pronouncements and small essays, and also partly just through oral history within the DSA from a lot of the older members, which we can get into when we talk about the different groups in DSA. But there's another element to Harringtonism, quote unquote, which is equally important, I think, because more important because it actually is a lasting legacy and is what allowed DSA to become what it became, which is this. Within a socialist organization, so regardless of what it's doing, right? Is it a party? Is it like trying to turn the Democratic Party into a social democratic party, whatever? Within the socialist organization, there needs to be two things. One, actual democracy, like, of the sort that you would, and it's a very like liberal democratic conception of democracy, right? But like, elected leaders and like parliamentary procedure, you literally using Robert's rules, like what they use in like bingo groups and like, and civil society organizations like the elk lodges and stuff. But, there needs to be actual democracy is number one. And the other thing is that there has to be pluralism. There has to be protection for those who would dissent from the majority position. There can't be this attempt to prevent people from speaking out in public if they disagree with the decision that was arrived at, and the third part, which some people disagree with, is that there can't be Stalinists. Because I think that the lesson that he took from the SDS thing is that precisely because these groups that were like these cadres from other sort of so-called democratic centralist Marxist-Leninist parties, that were all operating under the strict party lines of their central committees, which theoretically were elected, but in fact all the elections were basically rigged by slates to make it the same people who founded it were there forever in perpetuity dictating the party line. Those kinds of parties can't actually be good faith partners and can't actually enter the organization in bulk without trying to turn it into just a larger extension of their little cult. And so his like protecting pluralism meant not only internal protections for different opinions, but paradoxically banning anybody who was a member. See, the interesting thing is that it's not ideology based. It's not based on the idea of you not being able to express Marxist-Leninist beliefs, whatever the hell that is. Instead, it's if you're a member, if you're under the discipline, I think is the exact phrase in the Constitution, of a Marxist-Leninist org, you cannot be part of DSA. And I think that what this ends up being essentially is like SDS insurance, like making sure that something like the Parliamentary Labour Party can't come in and try to turn it into its own thing. And we can debate the merits of that, but what these components, these the internal democracy and protections for pluralism and dissent within the org, what those did, I would argue, without Harrington meaning them to be so, is that they allowed DSA to become what it is now. Because what ends up happening is that the first kind of bump to DSA was actually not it's actually still in this ancient history business. It's when the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, which was Harrington's organization that basically had this structure, merged basically on its terms, as I understand it, on DSOC's terms, with the New American Movement, which was basically this kind of third campus sort of communist movement that was doing some kind of work. I don't really know enough about them, but I do know that they were more less social democratic, more communist of some sort, but with democratic commitments and blah, 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 blah. And those people were kind of absorbed into DSOC, and that's what created DSA. But what's interesting is that partly the reason why that was able to happen was because there was an inherent sense in the structures that Harrington and company, because it wasn't just Harrington, it was a whole bunch of them. Harrington was just a kind of theorist for them, was that a socialist organization has to be democratic and pluralistic. Pluralism means that it's multi-tendency. As long as you're able to play ball with the idea that the internal structure of the party, or the organization, because again, they weren't a party because of Harrington's other strategy, which failed. If the internal structure of it is democratic, and you have the ability to express different points of view within it, and if you're down for that, then you can believe whatever and still be a part of it. So that attitude, which was partly in the law, so to speak, it was partly a de jure attitude, but it was also partly a de facto, more cultural attitude, allowed them to absorb NOM, created the DSA, and then the DSA was just a really shitty, boring, social democratic pressure group on the Democratic Party, which sometimes even failed to be that, because in the 90s, they freaking turned a whole bunch of people who were neoliberal reactionaries into vice chairs, and they turned, which is an honorary position. It doesn't actually give you decision-making power, but it's a nice little laurel that you can wear. So Cornel West is one, and he's pretty okay, but we gave it to a whole bunch of people who shouldn't have had it.
Yeah. That was my first encounter with the DSA, was in the Bush years, and I remember I was flirting with I wasn't flirting, I was a fellow traveler to the SPUSA at the time. In the very end of the Bush years.
They hate us.
And they do, and I said McNally, that's a different socialist. It's McReynolds, who, ironically though, McReynolds resigned from the SPUSA in 2015, and has founded his own branch of his own socialist party here in Utah, which was funny, because it's where I live. When I was a fellow traveler to the SPUSA, they had a problem with a mixture of weirdly left comms and Maoist and ideology, but who were not democratic centralists, because I wasn't either. And there's a lot of shenanigans involved that kind of de-radicalized that party a little bit, and then McNally was, I guess, accused of making racist comments in the light of the Charlie Hebdo shooting, and was outed and then resigned. And he formed his own mini party here in Salt Lake. Or I don't know if he formed it, but it was over him. So
how'd you encounter DSA? You were gonna say?
Oh, I encountered them because they were at the time they were smaller than the SPUSA, which is saying something.
Oh yeah, they were teeny.
And I was just looking at non-sectarian socialist organizations, and I knew about Cornel West, and knew about Barbara Ehrenreich, and I was like, oh, these people are interesting. I know them from all this progressive media stuff. Now, and as a side note, I was involved in the right-wing anti-war movement, not the left-wing anti-war movement. So, I read these people, but I read them kind of hostilely, and I was becoming kind of a socialist in light of what I saw was going to be a financial crisis, which happened. So this also gives you the time period in which this is happening. And I just saw who was on the full board, and was like, these people are not even as progressive as the fucking Progressive Caucus.
Exactly. And I think that's absolutely a correct analysis of where DSA was, I would say, from the late 90s to the crash. Because, actually, no, more precisely, the late 90s to 2011. Because, now, I mean, there were still principled Harringtonite Social Democrats hanging around. But it was very tiny, first of all. And they didn't actually do much. That's the other thing. So there were like locals, and the locals basically just got together, and they were like little tiny social clubs of old people. And to the extent that the DSA did anything at all, it was the National Political Committee that did things. And that National Political Committee tended to be extremely opportunistic and just like, even like basically endorsing neoliberals, just in a desperate attempt to supposedly move the Democrats to the left and be a pressure group for social democracy, but really just not. So I think that experience is absolutely right. And to the extent that like kind of old timers on the left still think of DSA as like, what it was in the 90s, I can imagine them being extremely surprised to hear like, somebody like me saying these things, and they must think that I'm insane. But that's actually partly my point. DSA, what it is now, is not what it was then. Not because there was any magical eternal revelation, but simply because what DSA was back then, I would argue, was more a husk. There was the mechanism by which you could create like a broad-based, decentralized group of community organizations, geographically localized and spread and blah, 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 blah. There was procedures in the Constitution for creating a new local, and that was a decentralized procedure because any group of people who joined, which you just do by paying dues, could self-organize or get the help of staff in organizing themselves into an organizing committee, and then voila, you have a chapter. Like that technology, quote unquote, existed within the Constitution, but it was largely unused, and it was really just, a bunch of people who had been on the left in the 70s and knew each other and kind of had like aged together in their struggle and, like kept in touch through it.
Right.
Some reading groups. And then, like, this opportunistic National Political Committee that just, and occasionally endorsed Democrats. Yeah. Now, what changes? Oops, sorry, you go.
The only thing I'd add to that is I think that the first big bounce of DSA's membership to the 5,000, which it had and stayed at for over 30 years, even though that membership changed. That was about their threshold number, which admittedly, for those of you who've been in any sectarian organizations, is actually kind of large for a left-wing group. But it was its cap for forever.
And more to the point, those 5,000 were what we call paper members.
Yeah,
they were people who paid their dues and never did anything. Didn't even show up to chapter meetings.
And so, if there ever was one, that was the only thing. That was the other reason I didn't join. Is I couldn't tell where there were ever locals or anything. So, admittedly, this is 2006 to 2008. And I was just out of college at the time, too. So that was a context for all that. And I'm of a generation of very old millennials and very young baby boomers who were pretty much their only foray into left-wing culture whatsoever in their college years was anti-war protests. And people forget about this, but most of the socialist organizations, and not just the DSA, but in general, in the early 2000s, in the late 90s, they'd all long since gone stagnant.
Yes, absolutely. The left as such was basically dead.
Yeah.
I think. I mean, it's more complicated than that, I think, because there was the ultra-globalization movement revival.
Right, which I was part of, but that actually led me to the right wing, believe it or not. So
I can believe it, because it was weird. But, like, other than that, which I think 9/11 put a real lid on.
It did.
there was the anti-war movement, which was mainly driven by these kind of small Stalinist sects.
Small Stalinist sects mixed with very I wouldn't say opportunistic actually, but idealistic in a different way. Right wingers, which people kind of forget.
The paleocons
were
all anti-war, right? Like the people who say that the Jewish lobby controls America and stuff.
Yeah, even though I have Jewish ancestry, I never believed that. But those were the people who got me because when I met like Code Pink and then an International Answer and some of them were Trotskyists, but when I actually dealt with them, I was like, oh my God, you were these weird culty. I don't even know. Like people forget about this, but at the time, like I remember people lecturing me about how I should be supporting Ahmadinejad.
Right.
And like the right wing of Iranian. I was just like.
Critical support for Baathists.
Yeah.
Saddam may not be perfect, but he's one of ours. It's like, well, is he actually?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I remember
it's like, well, is he?
And I just remember going, hey, at least these libertarian paleocon people are fairly honest about their reprehensible views. Like I'm not being baited and switched here. And then there's all these anarchists who I knew around like ZNet and all that. And all that kind of, dissolved into Occupy and then dissolved.
Well, this is where I might disagree a bit because people they're really down on Occupy nowadays. It's very hip.
Well, I was down on Occupy before it was cool as a hipster.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. You're the Occupy hipster. You're like, this is garbage even before it happened.
Exactly.
But
I didn't think it was garbage, actually. I thought it was necessary, but I didn't think it was going to actually state my views on it precisely. I thought it was really important, but it was really important how it failed. Because I thought it was doomed. But I wanted to know what was going to happen from it. Because it could I knew it was going to revitalize some kind of left-wing thinking, but I didn't know how. And I stick by that, actually.
I think that's a good take, I would say. For me, I'm a slightly younger rung of the same generation as you. You're like the in-between millennials and Gen X. I'm like middle millennials, the way I would describe it. And like, I was born in 93. For me, and I think for a lot of people in my age cohort, Occupy was, especially since we had missed out on ultra globalization, was the real revival of the sense of possibility that there could be anything to the left of the Democrats. And more to the point, I think, on a sort of more, call it sentimental, call it spiritual, whatever level, the idea that, actually the world as we've received it doesn't have to be this way. The supposed end of history is actually just a historical period, which actually just now is even ending. Capitalism, it doesn't have to be the only way of structuring our social and economic and political relations, and actually other worlds are possible if only we can figure out how to make them happen. That whole thing, I think, was just there was no popular constituency, certainly among people my age, for views like that. And I think that Occupy was the first moment when not only those views started gaining currency, but in which, from an institutional point of view, different elements of the kind of proto-left or dead left could actually get together in the same park, in a circle, and with people who were not on the institutional left, people who were just students or homeless people or people who had been foreclosed on in their houses or whatever, and talk about their experiences, professors, whatever, talk about their experiences and talk about their knowledge base and talk about what the hell is going on, why did the crash happen, how exactly is the political system bought out by the banks, should we be reading Marx again, why did this happen to me, why is my boss such a tyrannical piece of shit, whatever. And people being able to kind of make connections between their experiences and be like, hey, something like that happened to me too. And then the Marxist sociologist professor pipes up and is like, well, actually, if you think about the historical origins of wage labor, blah, 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 blah. And I think that, even though it just looked like a bunch of people in a park not doing anything, the very fact that was happening. And there was actually a lot more to Occupy than just that. I do think that there were committees that were actually trying to get things done. And did succeed to enough of an extent that they had a kind of afterlife for a few years afterwards, even after the whole bigger thing split up. But in general, my sense is that the main achievement of Occupy was to be able to get people talking across those barriers, both class barriers, but also like ideological barriers of like, past arguably dead left-wing movements, to be able to sort of grope their way towards a new story. And part of the story that we actually got in the Sanders campaign in 2016, I would argue, the whole spiel of the last 40 years, more and more has been going to the 1%, and privatization and deregulation have meant that other incomes are stagnant, and blah, 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 and blah, 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 blah. Like, that stuff is basically the neoliberalism story. And that story did not exist in 2010. I mean, I'm sure it did exist in as much as, like, alter globalization people have been talking about neoliberalism and blah, 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 blah. But, like, the application of that whole way of looking at the world, the latest phase of capitalism, whatever, to our present conditions, and why the world looked the way that it did, why the 2008 crash happened, blah, 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 didn't exist before Occupy. I would assert that very strongly, and I think that that's actually like part of what made the later movements that came about possible, including the Sanders campaign, but also the pipeline struggle, the Black Lives Matter, blah, 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 blah. Now, the reason why this is important to DSA is that the first big bump in DSA happens after Occupy. And it's not a huge bump, but it's a bump that starts getting like people who are new to the left in general and who are interested in the same kind of thing that Occupy was doing, that is creating a new language by which to talk about the possibilities of a socialist politics, into the organization. And so what initially happened in DSA was that you got all these occupiers over the course between 2011 and 2016. You got a whole bunch of occupiers and Occupy adjacent people who joined DSA. And some of them were anarchists, but not many of them. The majority of them, and I was actually kind of one of them because I joined very late in this. I joined in March of 2016. But after having been kind of like through 2015 screwing around and showing up to DSA things, but most people who joined were really more adjacent to the Jacobins, and I'm gonna talk about them when I talk about like the groups within DSA. But the main important thing to get is that there was then, because of that bump, which took us back up, we had fallen for a while, and then that took us back up to like 5,000 or so, was that there came to be a left wing of DSA and a so-called right wing, but it wasn't even really considered the right wing. It was considered more like the olds, because it was really a generational divide. And DSA for the first time started looking in a lot of its new chapters like a median age 30 organization rather than a median age 60. And I think that ended up being the result of all these people joining who also were looking for like a more radical but democratic socialist politics. And since the DSA was around, and since they were internally democratic, and since they protected pluralism, they were able to join and organize.
I want to stop you there for a second, even though I think it's going to build into it. But but what you're describing is not unique to the DSA up to that point, because all socialist institutions,
of course,
saw a bump after Occupy. I mean, like, except for the absolutely most sectarian, distrustful of the public ones.
No, I absolutely agree. You're totally right. But I think that there's a difference.
Well, I mean, there obviously must have been, because the thing is that those bumps after Occupy, for most of those orgs, were very short-lived, and some of them immediately, I think of like Kasama Project or any number of them that completely disintegrated shortly after Occupy did, even though they saw an initial huge bump afterwards.
Right. And I think that's key to the whole story, is those 5,000 people, broadly speaking, are still in DSA. So the real interesting question is what happened when all those people joined that didn't cause them all to leave or for the organization to split again or blah, 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 blah.
Which happened everywhere else. I mean, the other thing that happened in all the old socialist organizations is I mean, this isn't talked about, but I see them as directly related. We had a number of rape crises, and I think the reason why we had them is not because of the new membership causing them, but because the new membership was basically exposed to a lot of the toxic culture of these left-wing orgs, and wouldn't tolerate it the way it had been tolerated for 20, 30 years prior.
Yeah, and that has a lot to say, I think, about the very positive influence of feminism and university critical theory on the movement, I think, because I think that a lot of the more productive strains of critical theory and cultural studies stuff from the 90s came out of a place of being like, well, all this stuff with Marxists where they take power, it's authoritarian, and where there's and where they don't take power, they create these little cults which are all run by men and oftentimes like run by rapists, and then they don't, like the SWP stuff. But I think that like there was an attitude of like, well, we need something more, we need something different that actually accounts for pluralism and difference. And actually pluralism is the wrong word. Difference was the word du jour of like the 90s. And I think that led ultimately to identitarianism, I think. But its intermediate effect, I think, was actually good in as much as it led the kind of at least one, and I think actually like this is true in the anarchist scene as well, the socialist organizations that are more still universalist in the sense of like campaigning for things that will be of universal benefit to all of humanity or whatever, nevertheless are much more sensitive to issues that come up when you have a multicultural society, issues that are particular to particular like ethnic groups with particular histories of oppression, gender based issues and sexuality based issues that can't just be accounted for as like, well, we'll sort it out after the revolution, particularly when they have to do with interpersonal relations between people in the org. A lot of that comes from an engagement with this kind of like petty bourgeois critical theory. And I think that to the extent that it doesn't get turned into an excuse for these kinds of purity purges and stuff, like it actually makes the movement stronger. And DSA, this is all an example of a kind of influence from the outside that DSA was able to absorb and internalize without creating a split, and the organization became stronger for it. Another one is the influence from Trotskyism and the idea of like mixed system, post-war social democracy isn't enough. We need something more. We need something more radical. It needs to be a transitional program from that into a properly socialistic society. A lot of that came in with like the Jacobin people, who are not Trotskyists but are influenced by it, and I'll get into that later. And my point is just this. When you have this post-Occupy DSA, all this stuff is happening in terms of like getting all these outside influences. And the key thing is that the left-wing pole of it, the people who consider themselves more radical than social democracy, which organized itself in this now defunct group called the Left Caucus. And it was everybody to the left of social democracy. So like I was in it, and like a whole bunch of people were in it. And then the olds, like the people who had been there before, the so-called Harringtonites, the key thing is that their relationship was not antagonistic, because the norms that had existed within the organization, both in terms of its formal institutional structures and in terms of its culture, the culture of like multi-tendencyism and pluralism as a good in itself and free speech as a good in itself, meant there was on both sides an active outreach to the other side. Each side gets something out of being part of the same org together, and it's not seen just in this kind of contractual way. There's actual solidarity being bridged. And like I said before, that it was a generational divide as much as it was a political one. And in a similar way, the way in which that divide was leveraged was also a generational thing. Rather than it being a battle of the generations, which of course to a certain extent it was, the way in which interpersonally, on a human level rather than ideological level, people were interacting with each other in the organization was one of intergenerational interchange. Being able to be, if you were a Left Caucus person, friends with like one of the Harringtonites, such that you would like get them to tell you stories about what it was like to be on the left in like the 70s and stuff, and all the old sectarian battles and stuff. And the people who were the Harringtonites being really excited, even if they didn't fully agree with all of us crazy left-wingers, about the fact that there were actually new young people in the organization, and fostering that, dedicating a staff member to, rather than hindering us, actually like helping us create new organizing committees for new locals through the process that had been established beforehand, and actually like helping the left caucus to grow, even though some were suspicious. We, like they gained their trust, over time, basically helping that caucus to like giving them a table at the annual conventions and conferences and stuff. And in turn, the left caucus didn't see itself as a disciplined sectarian cadre trying to take over the organization. They did want to push it in a certain direction. They were open about that, but they wanted to do so through the means that the organization itself had set up for internal debate and decision making. And what they wanted to do especially was to make the organization as a whole stronger by making it left-wing, in the conception of left-wing that the left caucus had. Now, there was actually no consensus within the left caucus, because like I'm this kind of like reformist anarchist, and there were also Jacobin Marxists who, even though I kind of half share their politics, they, were different in a lot of key ways. So it wasn't so much a platform as a set of, we didn't use this language, but basically points of unity of what needed to happen in DSA. And there were two big ones. One was there needs to be a pragmatic political strategy for moving us to the left of the Democratic Party, to the left of like realignment politics. And the other one was that there needed to be cadre. And I didn't like this term because it's a stupid trot term, and it comes out of Leninism, which I don't particularly like the Leninist conception of the party and the movement. But the basic idea was we have a bunch of paper members who just paid their dues and don't do anything. What we need is like an active membership that does things, whether both within the organization in terms of having meetings, having reading groups, whatever, but then also that does things in communities that actually like make the world a better place and aren't just electoral politics, which isn't just base building and mutual aid, but is like actually participating in the social movements, actually participating in trade unions and moving those trade unions to the left and actually securing union democracy, all sorts of stuff. All the tentacles that DSA now has in a whole bunch of different, social movements, like were basically established by people who were left caucus adjacent and people who were down to like fuck with left caucus type stuff, even if they weren't a part of it, just because like it was cool. Like, oh, cool, we have an initiative that's trying to organize this workplace now, like that is technically this other union, but it's a whole bunch of DSA people. Cool, I'll join that. We've got a whole bunch of people fighting, doing collaborations with Black Lives Matter and anti-racism stuff to put together this march or this, or put together this reform for a police reform law or whatever. Cool, let's do that. So the two sides weren't like this like opposed sides to each other. I mean, they were in some ways. The Social Democrats were still really influenced by the Harrington idea of moving the Democrats to the left. But the key thing was that the organization grew because both sides learned how to work together and be able to follow the kind of cultural norms and the institutional procedures enough that it basically made the organization as a whole stronger through the ideas that people legitimately were convinced by winning out. You see what I mean? And that it aided both the integration of the new members and the growth of the organization as a whole. Because what ended up happening was that we put together a pipeline for creating new chapters. Now, sorry, that was a whole lot. But the reason why this is important is because it's in that context, in the context of that growing organization, that the Trump bump happens. And it's in the context of an organization that looks ideologically like the particular mix that I was just describing, that you get because of first the Bernie movement and then the election of Donald Trump, what internally in DSA people tend to call the Trump bump, which is the massive overnight kind of growth of DSA, where it went directly from, I think, 5 to 12,000, if I'm not mistaken. That was the numbers. And that was not just a function of people Googling democratic socialism. That's the first part. That's a necessary but insufficient precondition for it. The other part of it was that the infrastructure that we had set up over the course of the previous few years, because of all the stuff that I was describing, to like integrate new chapters by like if 5 people sign up from the same area but they don't know each other, having a staffer who puts them in touch with each other to help them form an organizing committee, providing them with sample bylaws like that allow them to start making decisions and doing stuff right away, like, and then the more subtle cultural stuff like that we were talking about, and I can talk about more if you want, like all that stuff was already in place, and although the organization was put under an enormous amount of strain, like, you know, we had to like basically like double our staffers, and we couldn't pay people at first because we had to get the new dues first, and it was a whole mess. And I wasn't actually involved in that at all because I was just the rank and file person, but like the national office apparently went nearly insane in those months. But because of that, we were able to not just integrate all those people on a practical level, like we were able to process the dues and create new chapters, we were also able to culturally integrate them. And that's where the real strength and resilience of DSA comes, is that it's not the Bernie bros who joined in 2016 anymore. Those people have now evolved and become acculturated to a much different internal culture of what I can only really describe as a multi-tendency, non-sectarian, socialist, broad-based socialist movement that then has different poles within it trying to push it in different directions, but also is like a coherent culture of its own. Okay.
So what do you see as the pitfalls that you're going to have in this transition? What are you going to have to look out for? We talked about the SDS problem. We also have the ever-looming problem of the inability to really have a coherent relationship to the Democrats. And I think the Ackerman plan for the DSA, I mean, it's not his plan for the DSA, but it's definitely involved it, kind of illustrates some of those issues. And then the last question that's related to that, what do you see is going to be the tension in the DSA? Because what I see happening is that there seems to be an increasing tension between some of the locals and nationals.
Yeah, so I mean, it's very complicated because there's a million things that could go wrong, and there's, you know, like, it's not easy to describe those without first kind of describing the factions that exist within DSA, if that makes sense, because it's easier to kind of get into it after you kind of have a sense of like what the internal culture looks like. Then it's like, okay, what problems can that culture run into given the material conditions that it faces? And then like it makes more, in other words, do you mind if I go on that tangent first and then answer those questions? Because they're very important, but I feel like I can't unless So basically after the Trump bump, the biggest group within the DSA is not Bernie-crats. I think it's very important because it's a misconception outside the organization. And I'm not saying that because I want to make the organization have more radical credibility and like, you know, like more bona fides for internet radicals. I'm literally saying it's incorrect to believe that. The actual status of most of the people who are currently in DSA, I say as someone who has experience of 3 chapters, one of which I helped found. For lack of a better word, it's non-denominational socialists. That's my kind of jokey term for it. And the way that people talk about being a non-denominational Christian, it's like people who don't subscribe, and this is how they will say it, because there's a culture of sort of anti-theory, anti-intellectualism in DSA. Like, I'm just interested in doing the work, and I'm just interested in building socialism now. And I think the Marxists are right about a couple of things. I think the anarchists may be right about a couple of things. But I'm not one of these people who is a sectarian or who is like stuck to one ideology. Like, I'm interested in doing the work. I want to see how we can like actually build worker power in workplaces now, or I'm interested in how we can seize state power now, or whatever. And the reason why that's important is because what this means is that there's a lot of people talking to each other across traditions. And more to the point, like when you go to like one of these DSA after drinking events, you'll have like, you know, an old school third campus Trotskyist getting into a yelling match with me, this kind of reformist anarchist, and then the third person in the room is like a, you know, but like a friendly yelling match, like, no, you should read Murray Bookchin, like blah 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 blah. It's like, I've never heard of this Bookchin guy, but you know what, you should go back and read, I don't know, like Schechtman or something, I don't know. But the point is, the third person is like, well, you know, I don't know if either of you two are right, but both of those sound interesting, and you know, I might pick one of them up. And that's the kind of culture internally that people are reading a whole bunch of stuff. I would say devouring, like, you know, the whole basically gamut of the left-wing tradition, and then sometimes they're becoming part of one of the more organized, formal ideological groups, and sometimes they're not, and sometimes they're becoming part of one of the more organized, formal ideological groups, and sometimes they're becoming part of one of the more organized, formal ideological groups, and sometimes they're becoming part of one of the more organized, formal ideological groups, and sometimes they're not, and sometimes they're becoming part of one of the more organized, formal ideological groups, and sometimes they're becoming part of one of the more organized, formal ideological groups, and sometimes they're becoming part of one of the more organized, formal ideological groups, and sometimes they're becoming part of one of the more organized, formal ideological groups, and sometimes they're becoming part of one of the more organized, formal ideological groups, and sometimes they're becoming part of one of the more organized, formal ideological groups, and sometimes they're becoming part of one of the more organized, formal ideological groups, and sometimes they're becoming part of one of the more organized, formal ideological groups, and sometimes they're becoming part of one of the more organi and they're just kind of like absorbing all of them and being kind of the way that a typical American citizen is with regards to the Republicans and the Democrats. Well, the Republicans are right about some things and the Democrats are right about some other things, but at the end of the day, we're all Americans. It's very similar. It's like sometimes the Leninists have a few points, and sometimes the anarchists have a few points, and sometimes the social democrats have a few points, but at the end of the day, we're all socialists. Now, the reason why that's important is because that is the biggest group. These non-ideological, non-denominational socialists are by and away the largest group, by far. I would say that, probably of the new membership, it's 60 or 70%. Again, armchair estimate, not a census. And the rest of the kind of groupings within DSA have to be seen as poles of attraction that are trying to pull people in that group towards a particular set of ideological and political commitments in order to move the organization as a whole in that direction. But so to that end, those groups are as follows. First, there's the Social Democrats, and they're teeny tiny, like the old school Social Democrats of the sort who, well, there's two groups of them really. So there's the olds, and the olds are still around, and they're the old Harringtonites and blah 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 blah, and everybody likes them. They kind of have a sort of they're our mascot quality to them in our internal kind of online spaces. But they although they retain control over certain individual chapters like Detroit, they really aren't a major political force at all. The kind of classical Harringtonite, we're going to be a pressure group on the Democratic Party type ideology is actually really, really small and marginal. And even a lot of those people themselves are actually not really interested in it. Now, there's also still, I would say, new unreconstructed Bernie-crats of the sort that you'll find on Bernie Sanders memes pages, basically Americans who are only just now discovering social democracy through Bernie, and will say things highways and police forces are socialist because the military is socialist because the government pays for it and stuff. But again, tiny, put together, those two groups are maybe 5% at the maximum of the total membership. And I think that the Bernie-crats have to also be seen kind of dialectically as these people are the people who just get sucked in right now, and then within a few months, within half a year, they're kind of non-denominational socialists of the sort that I described before. So that's them. Then the biggest group, the really biggest, probably hegemonic at this point group, they probably have the biggest plurality of all the organized groups, is a group that I call, for lack of a better term for them, the Jacobin Marxists, or the Jacobins. And they themselves, I think, when I've said this to them in person, kind of are bemused at this label. But I think that it's important to label them that and not the other things that people call them, oftentimes pejoratively, social democrats or trots, because they're actually neither. In my reading, the Jacobins are a new tendency. They're the germ of a new ideology that is, I would call it parliamentary Marxism, and the way that and it has influences from both post-war social democracy and kind of Trotskyism and Eurocommunism, and it's kind of, I would say, it's affiliated with what's going on in the Latin American pink tide and with Syriza and Podemos, and this kind of the way that Bhaskar Sunkara, the editor-in-chief of Jacobin, once described it in an interview, which I actually think is the best way of describing it, is that it's the social democratic path to communism. It's something like, you referred to neo-Trotskyism before. I think that's giving too much credit to the idea of people read Trotsky and they're yeah, I want to be like this. It's more on a principle of convergent evolution arriving at something like Trotskyism. The idea of we need to have a party that contests elections, wins those elections, gets a government, implements all of the reforms that were taken away by neoliberalism that were mid-century mixed economy, social democracy, but then pushes beyond them. And this is always the part, at the end of the Jacobin article, think piece du jour of how neoliberalism ruined this part of society. It always gets to that point at the end where it's but then we need to move beyond social democracy into a real democratic socialism. And of course, the actual specifics of this get really vague really quickly, but it is sincere. or at least that's my reading from interacting with these people. Like the idea that there has to be something beyond, it has something to do with worker control, maybe co-ops, maybe some kind of market socialism. It has something. There's an increasing friendliness to some kind of economic planning, but but it's all very vague. But there is an idea that there has to be something beyond social democracy, but using a social democratic path to get there, and that is where you get the Ackerman plan out of. That's where you get like the friendliness towards certain kinds of market socialism. That's where you get the obsession with parliamentary and electoral questions, and that is the hegemonic tendency. That doesn't mean that they're the absolute majority. It just means that they're the biggest and largest organized minority, if that makes sense. And they have a hegemonic influence beyond the people who are kind of like self-identified with them, because like they've articulated over the course of the last 5 or 6 years in Jacobin and not just within the org, like a certain set of positions that then, for lack of alternatives, grow to be the common sense. So the Jacobins more based on this kind of vague affiliation than actually organized efforts, because they actually, as organizers, tend to create these like kind of tiny cliquish closed off friend groups that then take over like a working group or a chapter or something like that, and it's hard to get involved with it, and it's not internally like particularly democratic. And then this has diminishing returns, because sometimes they can like install themselves at the head of some thing that they wanted to affect very quickly. But it also means that like the way that most people affiliate with their ideas is through affiliating with their ideas. They can't really be a part of a caucus that's like the Jacobin Marxist caucus or something like that. They had the Left Caucus, but it wasn't just them. And they basically jettisoned it to create a tiny slate called Momentum, which now has some positions on the MPC, but like not enough to make it do anything without other groups. So their most prominent position is that Jacobin Marxists run the leadership of East Bay DSA, which is a large and influential chapter. And that's all I'll say about it, because there's some drama there, and I am not qualified because I live on the East Coast to get into it. So that's the Jacobins, largest minority, I would say. Remember, the vast majority are non-denominational socialists. Then there's the anarchists, or the libertarian socialists, and this is probably the second largest tendency. The caucus itself has over three, and I'm part of it, which is why I can say this. We have over 300 members now, actually substantially over 300, but I forget exactly how much. It was like 340. I don't want to go. It's over 300. Basically the intentional thing that we did is obviously the kind of anarchist who would be part of a group like DSA, which at the very least is going to like contest elections of some sort. Obviously is self-selecting to be not kind of like orthodox anarchists, but I think that the general tendency that, I mean, I was part of the initial organizing committee that wrote the manifesto, which was not intended to be like juridical, but ended up later kind of the rest of the membership actually really liked it, so they revised it in our internal process for doing that, and very flatteringly kind of stuck it in the Constitution. So now it kind of is the law of the caucus. But like in our initial thing, we ourselves made a big tent for people who are like anti-authoritarian socialists, and that is a range which kind of ranges from like hardcore like participation in the state is terrible and shouldn't happen, and like everything should be purely self-organized activity in civil society or trade unions or radical trade unions or whatever, kind of anarchists, to kind of like more like libertarian socialists like me, whose basic idea of organizing any kind of institution is basically anarchistic, like looking at federations and assembly democracy and bottom up and decentralization and that kind of thing, but are also like more open to like engaging in social democratic party politics under certain conditions. And so that's kind of our range. And with that, we've been able to attract 300 people in a caucus that does quite a lot of stuff. And I think that I would wager, and I don't want to toot our own horn because obviously I'm biased, but I would wager from just talking to people, both online from across the DSA and in my own chapter, that there's a lot of people who are friendly to libertarian socialist politics without joining the caucus because they think that it would be partisan. Because remember, we're talking about something where the non-denominational socialist types oftentimes act in a very similar way to the way that Americans act about party politics. And I think that's a very important dynamic to kind of describe to people. But who knows how big our hegemony is versus the Jacobins. There's fewer of us and we're new, but we'll see probably by the next convention how that stands. So I would say that we're the two biggest ideological groupings. And then there's a whole bunch of like miscellaneous communists. And communist is like a very vague term given like the variety of groups that go under it. But basically there's three clusters. So of the miscellaneous, and all the miscellaneous communists are very small. Like very small, but sometimes have reached beyond themselves. I mean, certainly people are more open to talking about communism in DSA now. But so there's Refoundation, which is a caucus, and it's a caucus that's difficult to get into because there's an application process and you can be rejected. So it's also not clear how many people there are in it. It's mostly ex-ISO people, so trots. But they also absorbed the Communist League of Tampa entryists that existed previously under the Spark Caucus. So now they've got left comms in there too, and it's I guess big tent communist. They should just call themselves the Communist Caucus, but as we'll see, there's another Communist Caucus. So, and they seem
so the Communist League of Tampa has entered the DSA as well, and I'm guessing with the remnants of the Red Party.
Yes, that's my sense. Well, they certainly had an entryist thing with the Spark. Well, I shouldn't say entryist because people will say that the anarchists were entryists too. And what I always tell people, which is the truth, is like we were anarchists who were already part of DSA and wanted to organize. Like, so I don't know what their deal is, but yes, there were CLT people who joined and they created a thing called Spark. And it was teeny, and I think it was like 3 people, and they just got sucked up into Refoundation. There was a whole press release about it. You can Google it. So anyway, Refoundation's interesting because I would call them big tent communist, but they're open to tankies. The tent is too big, as far as I'm concerned, because I'm very anti-tanky. And one of the things that they want to push for, some of their platform, it's all up on their website, is good in my view. But there's a very specific thing. They want like an independent party. So they want a hard break from the Democrats. They want and they want that party to contest elections. They want they're more open to base building, but they're not unanimous about it, and they're more really about like reading groups and political education, which maybe they want to monopolize, maybe not. The big thing is, because this is a sticking point for a lot of people, is that they want DSA to get its recruitment in the future from the left, not from, for lack of a better word, normies, ordinary people. Like, they want the recruitment to come from existing left-wing organizations, which means that they want to take steps towards making DSA more welcome to them, such as, like, creating this treaty, like, between a bunch of the big socialist organizations, of which we would just be one, among others, a treaty towards later integration, and most controversially, getting rid of the anti-democratic centralist provision. And they're especially interested in getting PSL people, it seems to me, to be more friendly into joining the DSA, which I think is a terrible mistake, because PSL is the quintessence, in my opinion, the Party of Socialism and Liberation, of this kind of like authoritarian, cultish, top-down, centralized, sort of thing. But again, my opinion. Other opinions will have other opinions exist, certainly. And Refoundation does some very good work, I should say. So that's Refoundation, and I don't know how big they are, but they are not huge. But they also have one NPC person who, after getting elected, joined them. So that actually tends to, give them an influence beyond their size. Then there's the Communist Caucus, which is California-based, especially in East Bay, and it's small, it's teeny, but it has a very big social media profile. And it's some left comms who, again, I don't know whether it's that they joined DSA or whether they were already part of DSA and became left comms, or were just left comms and organized or whatever, but they're left comms. And they're interested mostly in what I call mutual aid, because I'm a kind of anarchist, but they would call base building. In other words, doing work, non-electoral work in civil society that, builds up like, a popular presence and helps bring people into the organization because we're actually doing things for people, like a brake lights repair program or something like that. That's actually gotten them into trouble with the Jacobin Marxists who run East Bay, which was kind of its own drama. But they're basically California-based. I suspect that they'll eventually integrate into Refoundation, and I think that Refoundation should be called the Communist Caucus, but I won't tell the communists how to run their business, so they can do whatever they want. Then there's what I call the random internet Maoists and neo-Stalinists, which is people who were basically politicized via the internet and have, through basically like moving through identity politics, and going from kind of like liberal identity politics to fundamentalist identity politics, end up at this kind of like weird neo-Stalinism, neo-Maoism. And they mostly just troll DSA online spaces without joining it because they're obsessed with us and with posturing as being to the left of us. But some join us instead of PSL, because most of them who join an org at all join PSL. But PSL is still very small and it's hard to join. They have an application process, blah, 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 blah. So some of them join us. And there seem to be a handful of these kind of like Stalinists who have, and they're all very young, that have ascended to relatively high ranks in local, what's called YDSAs, like Young Democratic Socialists of America. It's basically our campus chapters. Mm-hmm. But there's very, very few of them, is my sense. Partly because internally, in their own internet culture, like joining DSA is kind of like selling out. So, but they do exist. And so that's kind of like the panorama. And I would say that like to summarize, the vast majority are non-denominational socialists who are open to learning from everybody. The biggest two organized ideological tendencies are the Jacobins and the libertarian socialists. And then there's also a smattering of communists and a very tiny sliver, especially in the youth campus groups, of actual neo-Stalinists. But again, that's not scientific. That's my impressions. I would call them more than like armchair impressions, but like journalistic, anecdotal impressions is the way that I would describe it. Sorry, that was a long.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I'm actually just trying to figure out how to what to do from there. So you think that basically, to summarize that into a coherent argument, because you kind of gave us and I don't mean this insultingly, an ethnological description of what's going on in DSA, which is good because I didn't know about how these factions were playing out either. But you would say that so the SDS problem is still open because of things like the Party of Socialism Liberation and other groups like it who are definitely Maoist, but not always necessarily explicitly democratic centralist in their ability to enter in the youth circles. I've had friends in Florida complain about this, about the Party of Socialism Liberation and also a group called the Knights of Labor.
That's right. They're at one of the universities. I'm familiar with them because they existed in our online spaces before joining the Knights of Labor. Yeah, they're tankies and they're all DSA now. Right,
and they cause a lot of problems for them, like because they do like Spark thing, like and I mean not Spark, but Spark, like Spartacus League, who are Trotskyists, but still, like critical solidarity with the People's Republic of Korea, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and stuff like that, like at DSA events, which sends everybody into conniptions, left, right, and center of the DSA.
Right, exactly.
Because who needs COINTELPRO when you have internet culture like that?
No, exactly. I mean, it's kind of like if the COINTELPRO FBI infiltration didn't exist, these people would invent it by themselves through their own ridiculousness. But, I mean, the thing that you have to keep in mind is that they essentially are able to join out of a loophole because, and this I think was very calculated is my sense. I can't prove that yet, but there was a very calculated, I think, sense in the 70s, when they were putting together the Great Law or whatever, you can't start banning people based on ideology because then that just creates a precedent that will eventually lead to like Demcent style dynamics of like purges and and splits. But you can police institutional affiliations. And if you use those as a proxy for like authoritarian behaviors and bad faith interactions, then you can generally get the job done. So the loophole, of course, is that these people, because they were socialized via the internet, not through a Leninist organization, like are not part of an organization. So if they join DSA, I mean, you can't prevent them from doing it without impinging on their freedom to, like have whatever ideas it is that they want. Now, why you would join an organization that explicitly is committed to democratic socialism, whatever that means, because obviously that's to a certain extent an empty signifier right now, because to the extent that it's not synonymous with social democracy, what does democratic socialism mean? Arguably, the entire organization of DSA right now is in the process of answering that question. But until it's answered, it's vague enough that it's democratic socialism. What does that mean? But why would you join a democratic socialist organization when you're one of these people who thinks that democracy is something that you can give up if it's convenient or necessary, quote unquote, and you can still be socialist? I don't know, but whatever. I mean, you'd have to ask them. You should get one of them to go on and yell about me and how sectarian and authoritarian I am and blah 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 blah. But yeah, no, I don't get it either. But they do exist, but not many of them. Like it's really mostly a problem on the campuses, and even then, like a handful.
Yeah. All right. Well, I guess the last thing that we're gonna have to talk. Well, I need to end this conversation now. But one thing we can talk about in a future conversation is what is with the organization getting younger. There is the danger of becoming a campus organization, which I think would be bad.
I actually don't think that's a danger.
You don't?
Believe it or not.
Okay.
No, because most of our growth is off campuses. This is a very important distinction from SDS. Most of our growth is post-college 20-somethings who are in just civil society, and looking for something that they can join to make a difference. And so most of our new growth, you'll notice, is not in YDSA. Most of the chapters are being incorporated are chapters in geographic places. And it's what's really great about this is that means that there's no age limit to joining, and it also means that people can join who come from very different walks of life. And to the extent that we have a hope of getting lots of working class members, which we're beginning to have, but we're still mostly a downwardly mobile professional managerial class type organization. But to the extent that we're getting working class members and expanding that working class member base, it's because we're geographically based and basically like a civil society organization that people can join, like a church, which I think is actually a very important analogy in terms of understanding the dynamics of it. It is a lot like joining a church.
Mm-hmm. So this is basically a para-party, non-union organization that does have political goals, but it maybe could become something like a party, but is not a party at this time.
Indeed, and there's disagreement within it, which I think will become more explicit as the 2019 convention approaches, about whether that's actually what we want to do. Because certainly people like Refoundation want us to be a totally independent party. Then there's the Ackerman strategy, which I think has the hegemonic position right now of we should have an inside-outside role towards the Democrats, which gets Bernie-crats elected nationally, but then that are under our democratic institutional control, but then also lays the foundation through passing election reform laws and stuff for third-party runs, which would also be under our auspices. That's the sort of steel-manned version of the Ackerman strategy. And then there's people like me who, I'm half an Ackerman strategy person because I think that we need to do that right now in order to prevent the utter destruction and rape of anything that's left of the welfare state. But I'm also one of these people, I've got my other foot in a camp of people who are why should DSA itself be the party? Why can't the party come out of DSA and be its own thing? But then DSA retains its status as an independent civil society organization. And that's something I'm going to write about in the future, because I think that it's very important for there to be this space outside of parties and outside of unions that is like a hub which people can use to get involved in all those things like unions and parties and civil society organizations and whatever, but that is kind of independent of all of them and also like the kind of Venn diagram like intersection point of all of them. Because like otherwise we get a socialist party into power, that party becomes corrupt or opportunistic. Who the hell can you go to? I mean, this is not like a theoretical question. This is the question that faces the Chavistas in Venezuela right now. They did some good things, but now, I mean, like even the left in Venezuela is like, yeah, this party is bullshit now. But the left that's like not just party establishment is split like 3 or 4 different ways, and they don't talk to each other, and they don't have a way of organizing. So what are they going to do? So like that's kind of where my thinking is. But regardless of what you think, the point is that there's disagreement, and that disagreement will be adjudicated democratically, probably at one of the conventions in the next 10 years. And that's really exciting. I mean, it has dangers, but it's really exciting.
Yeah, it is exciting. All right, well, this was a longer talk, but it's a good one, and I'm going to have you on a few more times to maybe get into more specifics of this, and also we talked about some things off recording about some trends in the left and also some trends in publishing that I'll probably revisit with you, and we'll talk then. All right.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you.